You know, it's my own fault. I was really just asking for it. I could have just breezed by the headline and we would never have had this show. But since I had to endure it, so will you. Hi, I'm Scott Ott with Bill Whittle and Stephen Green. And what I'm talking about is a letter from the new publisher of the New York Times. And, you know, some of you may be shocked and say, oh, wow, New York Times under new leadership. Yes, under new leadership of the same Kim dynasty that has been in charge of that thing since the 1800s. A new Sulzberger is now in charge. This one A.G. Sulzberger. And he has written a letter in the New York Times basically introducing himself and talking about the continuity of leadership, that the New York Times will remain committed to that same truth-seeking, unbiased spirit that has driven them low these many years and over a century. But that wasn't my problem. My problem was this one little sentence, and I have grown blind in the service of my country. So if you mind, if I put on these glasses, this is the quote that set me off today. He says this, A.G. Sulzberger says this: there was a reason freedom of speech and freedom of the press were placed first among our essential rights. Now, you would think, well, that's kind of a bland statement. Anybody would say that. You know, it's the First Amendment. We should all be in favor of that kind of thing. Well, here's what bothered me. And I'll give you the two minor things first. And then I'd really like to get Bill and Steve's thoughts on the other, what I think is the more important thing. First of all, there's a reason, he says, why the freedom of speech and freedom of the press were put first. Well, yeah, actually, the reason for that is an accident of history. The original submission of amendments to the Constitution in the first constitutional, session of Congress was made by James Madison as part of a deal he made essentially with people in the states where the vote came down really close on ratification, basically said, hey, we're going to include a Bill of Rights in this thing. But the first two amendments submitted had nothing to do with freedom of speech or freedom of the press. The first one, the original First Amendment, was about apportionment of representatives in Congress, and the second one, the original Second Amendment, was actually about congressional pay. Now, the original Second Amendment later got approved or ratified more than 200 years later. The first one just kind of went away and was addressed in other ways. So number one, it wasn't first. Number two, the initial beginning of the actual, what we know is the First Amendment, doesn't talk about free speech and freedom of the press. It starts off with saying that they didn't want to have state control of religion and we should have free expression of religion. So it's actually the beginning of the First Amendment is about religion, but they never say that on the left. Okay. I'm just venting, okay? So after that, gentlemen, the phrase that really set me off, and Stephen Green, I'll address this to you, is the phrase essential rights. Yeah. Now, what is wrong with a man like me who gets upset with a phrase like essential rights?
Because rights, by their nature, are essential. Whether you believe they're God-given rights or the Creator, as the founders said, or you think they are inherent to man's evolutionary nature, whatever it is you believe. If you believe in rights, then they are fundamental. They are essential for our happiness, for our well-being, for our life here on Earth. If it's inessential, then it isn't a right. I don't know how to say it any better than that. But I do know how to say the New York Times has not exactly been covering itself in glory lately. Just another example, Scott. This is one I pulled up just this morning. Maggie Haberman, who's been writing for the New York Times Walter Duranty division for about ever, I guess. That's unfair to Maggie. I don't think she ever actually excused any actual Holocaust, but I don't know, give her time. Anyway, who was it? The AP's Josh Lederman reported on Twitter that the Iranian government, the Mullah's regime, has blacked out Instagram nationwide in their effort to clamp down on the protests that are ongoing.
And Telegram.
Yeah, that's right. That's my members segment this week, if you want to become a member and see what we have to say about that. But Maggie Haberman's response to that, brace yourselves, was the president often blocks individual people from seeing the real Donald Trump Twitter account.
Oh, my goodness.
They can't do anything without attacking somebody on the right, can they? And you know what? This is what I tweeted back to Maggie, apparently, because I'm trying to see if I can get blocked from Twitter along with Bridget Johnson and Bosch Faustin and all the rest. I tweeted back to Maggie, I said, yes, because blocking individual annoyances from your personal Twitter account is exactly the same thing as a nationwide blackout of social media in order to obfuscate the violent putting down of peaceful protesters, you farting icehole.
Well, Bill Whittle, James Madison somewhat reluctantly introduced the initial amendments to the Constitution because of the deal I previously mentioned with what were then the so-called anti-federalists, who I don't believe were anti-federalists at all. In fact, they were the true federalists, but that's a historical argument that we don't need to get into. In essence, though, Madison introduced them out of a sense of duty, to an obligation to the people who had, swung enough votes so that they could ratify the Constitution in a couple of states. He did not introduce these amendments because he necessarily thought that they were essential. In fact, in his mind, the Constitution didn't need to talk about our natural God-given rights in any way because it had nothing to say about them. And so he was afraid, along with others who were among the framers and the ratifying generation, they were afraid that if you mentioned a few of our God-given or natural rights in an amendment to the Constitution, then the assumption would be that any not mentioned were not protected. The Anti-Federalists saw it differently, and so we do have these amendments, but it has persisted down through the ages, Bill. The New York Times, in fact, is the manifestation of what Madison was concerned about, aren't they?
Yeah, there's a lot to say here. I'll make it as brief as I can. As I've said many times, but by the way, was it Pinch and Punch Sulzberger? This one is Poke. I guess he'll be Poke, or maybe he'll be
perfect for the social media age. Yeah,
yeah.
Pouch, the marsupial Sulzberger.
It is a dynasty. So look, as I've said many times before, when you have a press that is this biased, you have a country that's suffering from AIDS, where the mechanism that is designed to root out corruption on all sides, in all parties, in all places, is now the agent of delivering and protecting corruption. In other words, the virus comes in through the cells that were designed to protect us against the virus. It's not that there's suddenly a biased newspaper. What happened was, in the 20th century, the consolidation of so many different individual papers meant that there was essentially the newspaper. 100 years ago, there were, in New York City, probably 30 or 40 newspapers, and you would read them all and try and triangulate your way in on the truth. So it's a little ironic for them to be talking about being the fountains of truth when, in point of fact, they're the fountains of ideology that is doing their very best to send 600 agents to Sarah Palin and make sure that no one ever mentions the word Benghazi or anything else. So there's that. As far as the rights thing goes, I agree with the idea that if we enumerate some rights, that assumes that those are the only rights that are protected, and therefore let's not do it. But I disagree with that position. I think the Bill of Rights was essential because it's the first time in history anybody ever wrote down the fact that these are protected from the government. I suppose it goes without saying that if you read the Bill of Rights, these rights, the Constitution does not grant you rights. The Constitution specifically says the governments cannot take away these God-given rights from you. That's a profoundly good thing to do. So just to address your issue of essential rights and non-essential rights, I'm with Steve on this. All rights are essential, and things that are not rights are not. And so how do you determine what is a right? Do you have a right to health care, as the left argues? Well, if you have a right to health care, that's a commodity. And if you have a right to health care, you have a right to food. And if you have a right to food, it has to be provided. And if you have a right to food, you also have a right to housing. And here's the thing I didn't realize until recently, folks. If you have a right to housing, then how can somebody have a better house than you? My rights are not gradated. I don't have less of a Fifth Amendment right than somebody who's richer than I am. Rights don't impose obligations on other people. Rights protect individuals. They don't give them things. They protect them from oppression, and so on and so on and so on. We should be having a discussion about what rights are and how you tell. But that would be the job of a free press, and that's not what the New York Times is. Donald Trump's great genius is his understanding of the power of publicity and messaging. And every time Donald Trump talks about the failing New York Times, I just get a warm sensation in the pit of my stomach. Yes, that's how you deal with these people, the failing New York Times. So, the only reason we aren't already living under the slavery of tyranny is because of the internet and the ability to go back to having not 40 newspapers, but 40 million of them.
Well, I'm sure when A.G. Sulzberger finished his draft of this letter from the publisher of the New York Times, he mixed himself a highball and remarked to Lovey how the little people were certainly going to enjoy his work.
You made me snort.
Lovey.
I never snort.
Oh, my God.
And that's the sense that I get from the whole thing. And I will tell you, I do think that this elitist, among a core of elitists in the journalistic and political set, they cannot see outside of their blinders. I think he truly believed when he wrote these things that he has, and his family has been the guardian of truth-seeking and unbiased reportage throughout the generations. I think he really believes that stuff. And I think that he can't possibly understand what it's like to be somebody who doesn't live in his world. The other thing is, when we get down to the Constitution itself and the whole idea of essential rights, I think that ultimately we were going to have a Bill of Rights. It's a moot point to discuss, whether or not that was a good idea. But I think the debate over what that means is essential, that we keep that up, that we need to keep talking about the idea that the enumeration of certain rights does not derogate other rights, and that the framers and founders and ratifiers of the Constitution certainly believed their rights were derived either naturally or given by God, and therefore government had nothing to say about them. And I'll just end on this, because we talked about how what Sulzberger said was wrong. It wasn't actually the first of the First Amendments, and the part that he highlighted was not the first part of the First Amendment that we know. But let me just say this. I fully endorse the first part of the First Amendment as we know it, which is Congress shall make no law.
Boom.
For Bill Whittle, Stephen Green, I'm Scott Ott. Thanks to the members at BillWhittle.com for making Right Angle possible.
Couldn't even report the content of the First Amendment without making it into fake news.
Right.